Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, and welcome to the month of Spooky 2018. During this month, you can expect the unexpected, hear the unbelievable, and witness stories that stretch the imagination. It's my hope that we will chill you a little and thrill you a little. On today's program, we have the 5th annual Ghost Stories with Sylvia. This tradition is one of my favorites. Why? Well, it becomes a contest of seeing who can come up with the best ghost story, Sylvia or myself. Of course, nobody ever wins, but we sure do have a lot of fun trying. Included on the show, we'll be presenting another story from my brother Jim, which he has called The Encounter. Now, I have a warning. This one is downright terrifying. Also, we're going to have 2 more stories from you guys, and I have to say, you have really come through with the goods this year. We've gotten some of the best stories in the 8 years of the podcast. So, let's kick this one off with another special edition of the 5-Minute Mystery.
Another 5-Minute Mystery.
This 5-Minute Mystery is being brought to you by the country of Germany and our very own Tom Williams. Tom takes a break from growing up to present us with this strange tale of mysterious doings down south. Let's get started.
Hello. Yes, this is Dr. Fangfist. Are you going to shoot me again? You're going to explode a what?
Hey, Chief. I think I found all the parts, but it's hard to know for sure. Sure was a mess. Don't know if it's important or not, but I found this here recording labeled Tom Williams and the Panther. I'll play it right now.
October, as Ron calls it, the month of spookiness. With its golden leaves, millions of them to be raked and bagged up and sent out somewhere to a dump. But that's another story. Every time I worked in the courtyard, either cutting grass or raking leaves, there was always this emaciated, one-eyed fox that came through the neighborhood and sat on the corner and actually watched me do my thing. I was never shocked at his presence. As a matter of fact, I was disappointed and a little surprised when I would turn around and he wouldn't be there anymore. But on this one particular October day, I was in the courtyard cutting grass when, for a split second on my left-hand side, there appeared a large black panther. Yes, the panther appeared and pranced 4 graceful steps and vanished as if it were fading into another scene somewhere or another dimension. I was not shaken by this incident, but more amazed by the beauty, the black shiny coat, and the gracefulness of the animal. It only looked ahead. It never looked in my direction, as if it was concentrating on something else ahead. I've never seen this animal again. It's a shame. What a beautiful animal. Well, anyways, I wish you all the best for the holidays. Sincerely, Tom.
Wow, this is going to take forever to clean up. Now, where did I put that there hit button?
Ezekiel cried, God owns. Ezekiel cried, Dry bones, Ezekiel cried. Dry bones, now hear the word of the Lord. Ezekiel connected them. Dry bones, Ezekiel connected them. Dry bones, Ezekiel connected them. Dry bones, now hear the word of the Lord. Oh, when your toe bone connected to your foot bone connected to your heel bone connected to your ankle bone connected to your leg bone connected to your knee bone connected to your thigh bone connected to your hip bone connected to your back bone connected to your shoulder bone connected to your neck bone connected to your head bone. Now hear the word of the Lord. Them bones gonna walk around. Them bones gonna. Them bones gonna walk around. Now hear the word of the Lord.
Well, there you have a mystery that really doesn't have a solution. The panther symbol is featured strongly in the Mississippian culture. It is believed to be a supernatural deity that resides in the underworld. This 5-minute mystery was brought to you by Germany and our very own Tom Williams. Thank you, Tom. How do I introduce the person we're about to meet? She's a librarian by day, ghost hunter by night, and all-around great author the rest of the time. You can find her books on Amazon, and we'll get her to tell us more about that later on. Who is this amazing person? Who, by the way, can tell stories better than anyone I know? I'd like to introduce Sylvia Shults. Hello, Sylvia.
Hello, Ron. How are you?
I am doing just fine. I'm sitting here excited because do you know what this means?
What does this mean?
Well, number one, it's the spooky season.
I know.
And to me, there is no better time than the spooky season. Am I right?
It is wonderful. Best time of the year.
It is. Secondly, I'm talking to probably the best ghost teller on the planet. Bar none.
Oh,
and I've heard a bunch now. Am I right about that?
I like to think so, yes. I enjoy what I do, and I love sharing stories with other people. And that's how you do it. You grab somebody and you say, hey, I've got this really cool story. You should listen to it. So, yeah, I love it. I love sharing those stories.
And top it all off, you are an extremely good novelist.
Thank you.
Well, I mean that. In fact, I was going to go get all of the books that you have written. And there's so many of them now. But can you kind of tell us, just so people know, why don't you take a minute and tell us the book titles? Because I think people would like to hear them. And why not start with it? Why always do podcasts have to end with the books you've written? So tell us about
right.
that.
Well, sure. Well, I started off, I've always known that I wanted to be a storyteller. I would tell myself stories and tales to while away the hours when I was doing chores. So I ended up growing up and not having to do quite so many chores, but I still enjoyed the storytelling. So I realized, hey, I could write these down and share them with other people instead of just having them inside my own head. So I started off writing fiction. I started off writing horror and romance. Fine line between the two, I will admit that. So all of my fiction is still actually in print. You can get it at Crossroad Press. And all my horror is there, all my romance is there. I have a really fun collection of romance novellas called Timeless Embrace. And it is the 3 ancient cultures, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and a mythology story thrown in for fun. And they're all romance, fun, happy, flippant little romance stories. And I have a couple of really vicious, nasty horror novels, too. I have Borrowed Flesh, which is about a demon. I have The Dream Watcher, which is about twins and a ghost who invades one of the twins' dreams. So, fun stuff. And several years ago, I was asked to write a collection of true ghost stories. And I said, oh, this is where it's at. This is where my heart has always lain. I've always adored true ghost stories. Grew up listening to my dad spin tales of the Screaming Mummy at the Field Museum and Resurrection Mary and the Ghost of St. James the Sag. So I grew up with that sort of thing, and I actually asked him at a family reunion a couple months ago, I said, people always ask me, how did the great Sylvia Shults become interested in ghost stories? And I always blame it on my dad, squarely on his shoulders. I said, where did you learn all these stories? And he said, wow, I really don't know. And he said a couple of the tales he heard in Boy Scouts, but he just kind of picked up these true ghost stories just by virtue of living in the Chicago area. So I'm just so glad and grateful that he passed that hunger along to me.
Well, I am here to tell you, I have read all of the ghost story collections that you've written. And the way you're not, well, of course, you knew I'd do that. But not only are the stories good themselves, but they're written well. And to me, the hardest thing in the world to do, and I know there's a lot of authors that'll disagree with me on this, but I'm an editor, so I'm right.
The editor's always right.
But the hardest thing to do is to write short stories so they grab you. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, I do agree with that. Because you can just lay out the facts, and that's just the facts. And sometimes the facts are really compelling. But if you can put emotion behind those facts and put human experience behind those facts, it makes it so much better.
Exactly. That's my point. And so it's harder to, in a short period of time, take a short story and turn it into something that's, well, epic. It's incredible. Gripping. Yes. That's the term. And you do it very well. There's no denying that at all.
Oh, Ron, you're very kind. Thank you.
But I got to be honest, I haven't read any of your romance novels. I'm sorry. I just haven't gotten to them.
Well, okay. Every reader has different tastes, and I understand.
Having said that, I have to ask the question, are you working on something now that may relate to what we're doing today?
I certainly am. I have been gorging myself on true ghost stories, and I'm currently researching 2 books at the same time, and it's just a matter of which one's going to be written first. But during all this gorging, I have read so many ghost stories, and a lot of them are really, really wonderful. Some of them are repeats. That's fine. I can recognize them. Some of them have the same themes, like crybaby bridges and things like that. Haunted bridges where some young woman hung herself after drowning her baby, and you can see patterns in some of them. But some of them just make me sit up and go, whoa, that was great. How can I use this? There's no project I can use this on right now. But it's so cool, I don't want to forget it. So when I was working on the stories for Spirits of Christmas, I was researching the Victorians and the Victorian love of ghost stories, and I learned about a fellow named Lord Halifax. This guy, his hobby was collecting true ghost stories, and he collected them all into a book that he kept for his family, and he would drag it out for the kids at Christmas. The kids, his sons, wrote in their memoirs going, "Oh yeah, I remember every Christmas my dad would just scare the paste out of us with ghost stories, and then we'd have to walk down this hall in this big creepy English manor house, and we'd have to go to bed after listening to all those stories." And our mother would say, "Well, Charles, don't you think you're scaring the kids?" And the kids were like, No, we want more. So I am very grateful to Lord Halifax for not only collecting some really corking ghost stories, but also for giving me the idea of writing down these stories that just stop me in my tracks and go, "Oh, that's good." So I have collected some of these stories that I've come across in my reading, and I will share some of them with you today.
Awesome. It's funny you should mention that, too, is one of the things that I did this year was I started taking all of the emails that I've been getting from my listeners and starting to write my own anthology of stories, taking their stories and putting them into a book format. And right now, I'm just looking at the list here. I have at least 100 stories, at least.
I would very much like to read that book.
Oh, and there's everything here from Grandpa Theradool to Pavlov's Response to Killer Nuns to I Hate Trains to piano games to Was It the Great Pumpkin? I have got over 100 of these incredible stories. And so that's my plan, is to do what you're doing. So I thought you might find that interesting, that I'm jumping on the bandwagon, as so to speak.
Oh, yes, Ron, please let me know when that comes out, because I will devour it.
Well, are you in the mood for a trivia question?
Yeah, lay it on me.
All right, here's the trivia question. What happened 5 years ago, almost to the day?
Oh, I think that the answer to this trivia question is that about 5 years ago, round about this time, 5 years ago, I was a guest on Ron Hood's broadcast.
You were. That was one of the first times you came on Ron's Amazing Stories. And it might interest you to know, this is the 5th year in a row you've come back.
In a row. Sweet.
Yes. And so that means it's time now for Ghost Stories with Sylvia, Volume 5. And I'm going to let you start with a story, and then I've got 2 from my listeners.
Well, let's start with the first one in my little handwritten book here. This is actually from Lord Halifax's collection. So it is in a bit of an old-fashioned writing style, but I think your listeners will enjoy it. This story was sent to Lord Halifax by Lady Margaret Shelley, and it's called Head of a Child. Sir Charles and Lady Hobhouse were giving a party at their place, Monkton Farley, and Miss Mary Hobhouse was talking to one of the visitors, who said, "I have had a strange and ghostly experience once in my lifetime. It happened when my mother, my little sister, and I were all staying at Sutton Verney. As the house was very full, my hostess asked me if I would mind having my little sister to sleep in my room. In the middle of the night, I woke up with the distinct feeling that a child's head was resting on my shoulder. I said, as I thought, to my sister, 'Maudie, why have you come into my bed?' There was no answer, and I struck a light, and on looking saw that my sister was fast asleep on her cot beside me. Presently I dropped off to sleep again, only to wake up once more with exactly the same feeling. But when I put out my hand, there was no child's head on my shoulder. After this, I could not sleep, and on the following day related my experiences to my hostess. When the same feeling came over me the next night, I began to feel very nervous, and for the rest of my stay, to my great relief, I was given another room, in which I had a peaceful night." As the girl was telling her story to Miss Hobhouse, another guest, Mrs. L., came up and said, "I know you are talking of Sutton Verney. We bought the place, and that room became such a difficulty that at last we pulled down the wing in which it was located. When the men broke up the floor, they discovered a cavity in which were the skeletons of 5 children.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And these are stories that he collected just wandering the countryside, or?
Yeah. Well, he was a lord, so he had a lot of visitors to his manor house, and they weren't shy about talking about their experiences. A lot of them were Mrs. L. They didn't want their names used, so they just went by their initials. But yeah, people were not shy about sharing ghostly experiences back then.
Wow. It's funny that people think that this whole ghost hunting phenomena is a new thing. It's not new at all. There have been ghost hunters as long as there's been dead people, I think.
Yeah. There was a wonderful guy in the middle of the 19th century named Harry Price, and I've read a couple of his books, and he is just delightful. He is so much fun to read. He's got this very dry, snarky British sense of humor. And I'm actually using one of his stories for the Ghost a Day book that I'm working on. He wrote an entire book on one of the most bizarre little stories that I have ever heard. It was about the ghost of a talking mongoose, sort of. He presented himself as a mongoose. His name was Jeff. Jef, or sometimes Gef, and he was like a poltergeist, but he talked, and he was a mongoose.
Wow!
And the reason I'm using it is because I think the date was June 5th. That was Jeff's birthday.
Oh,
so that's why that story is going to be included in the calendar book, because it was his birthday.
Wow. All right. Yeah. Well, I think it's time for one of our listeners to chime in. What do you think?
Yes, let's hear a listener story.
This one comes from Maurice Sanford in Lewiston, Maine. Hello, Ron. I've wanted to write into the podcast for a long time, and now is that time. You've been asking for scary stories. Here is mine. My wife and I were coming home from an event at the local high school and had to pass by a graveyard. It was a very stormy night. The rain was quite heavy, and I had to pay close attention to the road. Suddenly, my wife shouted out, "Stop the car!" I did, and I saw something I will never forget. Standing there, being drenched by the rain, was a woman dressed in all white. My wife said, "We have to help her," so I pulled the car over to the side of the road, and she rolled down her window. By the time she had finished rolling down the window, the woman was gone. I know this is a short and quick story, but that's all there is. I did get out of the car and looked around for her, but found no sign. I've driven by that graveyard many times since, and I've never seen her again. Maurice, Lewiston, Maine. Well, first off, thank you, Maurice, for your story. That is incredible.
Thank you, Maurice.
I don't know what to say about that. You know, it's interesting. There are 2 elements there that speak ghost right away. Lots of water and a graveyard. Those 2 things always seem to go hand in hand.
Oh yeah, and it's something with the fact that water conducts electricity so well, and most ghosts seem to be an electric charge of some sort, or have to do with an electric charge of some sort. So yeah, anytime you've got a big old rainstorm going on, that is just the perfect atmosphere in which to see a ghost.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Maurice, from Lewiston, Maine. I think I said it right that time. And thank you for your story. That's a good one.
Yeah, I liked that.
All right, Sylvia, I'm going to turn the mic over to you. What do you got that can beat Maurice?
My goodness. Well, let's do this one. This is a very strange little story that this is a more modern one, and it fits in with your "hey, this happened to me," the flavor that you get from your listeners that write into you. Okay, this story is called 11-year reality lapse. Back in 1976, my family was preparing to move into the house my parents had just bought. My sister and I were in the process of painting our new bedroom, mint green walls with white accents and ceiling. The forest green pile carpeting hadn't just been installed, but was still covered with the clear plastic, perfect as a drop cloth. The only other thing in the room was the ladder that we were taking turns using to paint the ceiling. My sister was on the top of the ladder painting while I was painting the molding. My sister said she was thirsty and for me to run down to the little market nearby and get us a drink. I said, "Give me some money." She reached in her jeans pocket, pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, and dropped it for me to catch. It never landed in my hand. Thinking I must have missed it, I started looking around, but couldn't find it. My sister got down and looked too. We never found the money. Now, in 1987, my mother was selling the house to move to Tennessee. The movers had already cleared out my sister's and my old bedroom, so it was as empty as when we moved in. I went in for one last look around, like you do when you're saying goodbye to a beloved former home. I was leaving the room when I heard a sound and turned around and watched as a crumpled up dollar bill fell to the carpet in the center of this empty room. I just marveled at the bizarre space-time continuum we call reality and put the dollar bill in my pocket and left the house, never to return.
Incredible. I have heard stories like this before, and to me, these are the ones that stand out as really, really hard to explain. Because
that I did write down the provenance of that. That is from I found that on Phantoms and Monsters blog, and it says MEIJ. So this is another person that just wants to go by their initials.
That is a really good story, and they're becoming more popular. These time shift stories.
Yeah,
they're really piquing people's interest because. Well, I don't know if there's a because, but there certainly is enough science going on that they have an idea that someday we just might be able to break through that time barrier and at least maybe view the past. And if we can do that, well, that might explain a lot of what we see today in these encounters where people see somebody from the 40s walking up the street and it's, 2018, or stories where they find themselves walking in an area that isn't on the map, but yet here they are. It's things like that.
I love stories like that.
It's interesting. My brother had a time slip story where time was taken away from him and with no explanation too. So, it's just they're becoming more and more popular. And the reason I think they're becoming more and more popular is they seem to be happening more and more often.
The veil could be getting thin.
All right. Well, shall we listen to another from the listeners?
Let's do.
Well, this comes from Stella Bennett in Los Angeles, California. She writes, "Hi, Ron. I got your message that you need some scary stories. Well, I have one. This one took place about 5 years ago when I was visiting my mother in the hospital. She was there recovering from surgery. A nurse came into the room while I was visiting and asked if I wouldn't mind leaving while she worked on my mom for a bit. I went out into the hallway, sat down in a convenient chair that just happened to be there, and began thumbing through a magazine. After a few minutes, a woman came up to me and asked if I knew where the doctor was. Not looking up, I told her I had no idea and to go ask a nurse at the station. She said thank you and moved on. It was then I looked up and saw that there was no one there, and by that I mean no one. To this day, I don't know if I saw a woman or just heard her. I did think that this was strange enough that you would enjoy it. Thank you for your podcast and all you do. It's a great show. Me and my sister look forward to it each week. Stella Bennett, Los Angeles, California." Thank you, Stella. That was
Thank you,
great.
Stella. That That was super. It gave me chills.
It did. There's something about hospitals. Now, we can get off on this subject.
Yeah.
There's something about hospitals that some really great ghost stories come from there. And I think you have some background in hospitals, if I remember correctly.
Not particularly. I try to stay away from that. Well, the Peoria State Hospital.
That's what I'm talking about.
I
your life. Your second life at, I can't even remember it now. But you have written an entire book on the subject. So
I have. I've written a book on the state hospital, and I've written a book about one of the patients at the Peoria State Hospital. So,
and I've read both those.
My mind was still stuck. Well, thank you. My mind was still stuck on modern day hospitals poke you with needles and the smell of alcohol, stuff like that, which is what I try to stay away from. But no, I have a very, very keen interest in hospitals as they are for the care of the mentally ill. And that is what I write about. That is what I feel very strongly about. So that's why the Peoria State Hospital calls to me so strongly.
Yeah, and that you kind of threw me for a loop when you said, "Oh no, I don't have anything to do with that."
No, I have no idea what you're talking about. Sorry.
Well, Sylvia, I've been holding out on you.
Have you now?
I have. I know. I said I had
these stories.
Yeah, I remember. I said I only had 2 stories.
I remember you saying that, Ron.
Yeah. Well, I actually have 3. And I think that I think that this story is one that we can end up on. Because it is...
That sounds fine.
Well, I took it the extra step. I actually added some theatrics to it. And I want to warn the listeners, this is not a lighthearted story. And why tell you about it? I'm going to play it right now. Are you okay with that, Sylvia?
Absolutely, sure.
Here is my brother and his story, The Encounter. What you're about to hear is a true story. It was sent to us by my brother, who has been a pastor for the Lutheran Church the better part of his life. You've heard his tales before, but I assure you, you've not heard anything like this. This is a story not to be believed or disbelieved. It is a factual account of what happened. I give you his story in his own words. He has called it Encounter. There are many ways in which people encounter the ineffable. Some of them are terrifying. Ron gives us, his fans and listeners, opportunities to share these encounters through his show. I know that it's sometimes difficult to tell these stories because our memories disturb us. I know that because I find no pleasure in recalling this particular event. But I've told the tale in one of my books, and the feedback I got showed me it helps some readers who have had similar experiences. So I'm reluctantly sharing it with all of you now. One of the great privileges in my life was the opportunity to work as a hospice chaplain, caring for hundreds of dying people over 5 years. Death is the boundary of life as we know it, and like any borderland that normally governs daily life, fails at the edges of things. The approach of death can be an occasion for ecstatic joy, but there are also passings shrouded in oppressive darkness. One thing that can be counted on is death is always an event filled with discernible spiritual energy. Knowing that, I've always been careful approaching a death setting. As chaplain, I work for a government-sanctioned for-profit hospice company. I was part of a team that included a physician, nurse's aides, a social worker, a chaplain, a music therapist, nutritionists, and so on. I believe that caring for my team was as much a part of my job as confronting the dying and their families. As part of that care, I made a practice to deal with the spiritually unsettled nature of death by offering, on their behalf, a silent prayer for protection every time we approached a scene where someone was actively dying. That prayer, rooted deep in the ancient church, was simple. Lord, let your holy angels have charge of us, and that the wicked one have no power in this place. One Wednesday I was called to a nursing home where a young female client was dying. I was told that 3 members of my team were already present in her room. On this visit, I forgot to offer my prayer. As it turned out, that was a mistake. What I saw when I entered the private room staggered me. The patient was sitting up in bed, but was not conscious. That position was unusual enough, but wasn't what caught my eye. I was shocked by her face. It bore the expression made famous by Edvard Munch in his painting titled The Scream, which later was made famous in advertising for a movie bearing the same name. Now, don't misunderstand me. Her expression didn't resemble the image. It was that image, precise in every angle and detail. I'll never forget it because it's burned into my mind. But there was more. Below her head and shoulders, which were oddly propped up against the headboard, was the rest of the body. It was encircled by polished round black stones spaced several inches apart. At the foot of the bed, a dark candle flickered, slowly melting into a pitch-black pool of wax. The drapes were closed, so the room was a dusky gray. Presiding over the scene was a man robed in a black cloak that concealed his face and body completely. That man, who I took to be her spiritual advisor, sat in stony silence in a corner of the room and never said or did anything to acknowledge our presence. The air near the bed was cold and clammy. When I looked at my hospice team, I could see that we were all suffocating in the evil atmosphere presided over by that silent, dying scream. After this had gone on for a while, I started to feel sick, so I resorted to a hospice worker trick. When a patient was just hanging on seemingly forever, we would sometimes explain to the family that people often waited until they were alone so that they could let go of life in privacy. The idea was partly true, but was mostly a way to give the worn-out family or tired team members an excuse to get out of the room. They could breathe some fresh air, go to the bathroom, or get something to eat. Families usually accepted the opportunity with gratitude. In this case, I offered the idea entirely for the sake of my hospice staff, and they all thought it was definitely the thing to do. Once outside the room, all 4 of us instantly formed a tight and frightened circle. We didn't say anything except a few muttered oaths like, "Oh my God." I offered a prayer, including the one I should have said much earlier, but it was too late. The spirit of fear and hopelessness had found its way into each of our souls. The only thing we knew for sure was that we didn't want to go back into that room. We also knew that as professionals, we had to do something. So we made a plan. Each of us, one by one, would enter the death room, spend a few minutes doing what we had to do, then leave to be replaced. I was in the room as the labored breaths that accompanied death slowly expanded fully, followed by the deep sigh that marks the moment of death. Looking at the body, I saw that the terrible scream remained. Her dead eyes were wide open and fixed in a baleful stare directed straight at me. At that moment, I came close to screaming as well, but turned my back instead. After that, it was all routine. One of our nurses pronounced her, our social worker arranged for the body to be picked up, and we each escaped to our cars. I learned later that all 4 of us attended various churches the following Sunday. This was unusual because 2 team members never went to church. I suspect it was partly because of the dark mood we had picked up that day that just wouldn't go away. That Sunday, the 2 of us who were active in our respective churches experienced the same extraordinary event. In my case, as I walked into the sanctuary, my head reeled and I fell to the ground in a dead faint. I quickly recovered and was aware that a crowd had gathered and someone was urging people to call 911. That woke me up fast. I stood up, claimed I had just slipped, apologized, and headed straight for the parking lot. At that moment, the oppressing spirit dissolved and never returned. This story has kind of a funny postscript. Government regulations require that each hospice team to provide a full year of support and services to bereaved families. This includes having a staff chaplain preside at the funeral of the deceased if requested. To my amazement, relatives of this woman asked for me. They wanted a service appropriate to the faith she was following at the time of her passing. Now, I'm an ordained Lutheran pastor, and I was sure there was no way I could do that. Unfortunately, the company I worked for insisted that my contract required me to perform whatever service was demanded, and that if I refused, I would be fired. The situation created quite a stir in the office, but my fellow team members risked their careers by standing with me in my refusal, and the company eventually backed down. I will always be grateful, not for just their support, but for the fact that I could end this terrible story on a note of grace. Jim Thompson, Rio Rancho, New Mexico. I don't have any words to describe the nature of this story. It is what it was. I want to thank Jim, my brother, for this story and for his courage to tell it to us. Thank you, Jim. Well, Sylvia, are you as freaked out as I am?
That was an amazing story. Wow, what an experience for your brother to have had. That was just eerie and terrifying and disturbing, and wow. I'm just glad that he had such a good team behind him.
Yeah, well, and not only do they have these great teams, but, to be a Lutheran pastor and to have the church available to him, too. I think that the whole scene where he is coming back to the church and the next day his head reels and he falls to the ground, that tells me something attached to him.
That was the thing that made me sit up and jump in my chair. Wow.
I mean, that just literally says, now I know you've written some books and you have some background with demons, but you don't think that sounds like a demon, I understand.
Well, the thing that gets me is that dark figure that was in the room, this spiritual advisor, quote unquote, that this young woman wanted to have with her in her final extremities. I don't know if that fellow or that person, if that person was trying to channel demonic entities. Seems to me to be a very foolish thing to do when someone's that close to the other side. I don't know if they were trying to call up demonic entities or deliver her soul into the hands of demonic entities. I don't know that there were any in the room at that moment, but man, why would you want to go that direction?
I don't know. And I have known my brother now, well, all his life. And for him to say, no, I'm sorry, I won't do your service, I can't imagine him even saying that. It isn't so out of character for him. He would not turn down anyone that wanted his help. And for him to say, no, I'm not doing your service, wow, to me that speaks volumes.
It does, yeah, but that was the caveat in the story was the family wanted a service appropriate to the faith she was following at the time of her passing.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody, no man of the cloth, Lutheran, Orthodox, Jewish, whatever, is going to have anything to do with that. So I admire his courage. I don't know where, if he had said yes, I don't know where he would have even begun to put together a service like that in good conscience.
Well, he was willing to lose his job over it. And that was the other thing that I liked the ending where his team backed him up and said, "Hey,
that was so cool.
Yeah, hey, we're not going to that funeral either." And that speaks volumes to the fact that something happened. My brother amazes me, and Jim, I know you're listening. You amaze me. You are an amazing person, and I think that this story just tells you just what kind of person he is. I appreciate him. And Sylvia, I appreciate you.
Thank you. That was a real wonderful story. That's the kind of story people ought to be telling when they encounter it. So, Jim, thank you for sharing that story with us.
Well, Sylvia, I think that we probably talked enough now. What do you think?
I had 3 tiny little dessert bites for you.
Okay.
And your listeners, if you'd like them. If you think we've talked enough, that's fine.
Well, you know what? Now that you said that, if I don't let you read them, the listeners are just going to absolutely kill me. They're going to write a bad review about Ron's Amazing Stories, the podcast.
We don't want that.
So
all right.
Definitely, let's hear your stories.
Okay, 3 little dessert shots to send you guys on your way. In the early 1900s, workers at the Lutheran Cemetery in Milford, Iowa, encountered a strange force that prevented them from building a fence along the cemetery border. Augers and other tools twisted, broke, and moved by themselves while a certain post hole was being dug. The frustrated men dug up the area and discovered an unrecorded coffin at the fence line.
Oh, wow.
Number
the dead
2,
will have their way.
They have ways of letting us know. Loudoun Cottage, New York. Abraham Lincoln's ghost has appeared in this clapboard cottage several times. Locals say that his spirit was brought to Loudonville by his blood and brains, his very life force, which spattered on the dress of Clara Harris. When the traumatized young woman returned to her parents' home, she hung the dress in a closet and had it walled shut. Clara Harris and her fiancé were the 2 young people that were sharing the presidential box with Abraham Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln when Lincoln was assassinated.
Wow.
So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, that is cool. And you said there's one more?
Yes, one more. A phantom known as Pitcher Man haunts Goose River Bridge in Rockport, Maine. He does not carry a pitchfork or brandish any other weapon. Instead, he offers a pitcher of beer to terrified witnesses. William Richardson was killed by 3 Tory soldiers on the bridge in 1783. They had taken it as an insult when he offered them beer in celebration of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. After the bridge was replaced in the 1920s, people began reporting the ghostly figure of a man holding a pitcher.
Wow. Again, the dead let us know.
Yeah. I just wanted to celebrate, man.
Yeah, well, you might have picked a little bit better group to celebrate with.
Yeah. I don't think the Tories are going to be very cool on this whole celebrating the end of the Revolutionary War thing.
Yeah, they're thinking, yeah, you just made a big mistake, buddy.
Yeah.
Well, Sylvia, I want to thank you for year 5. To me, this has been the best one yet. And I'm not just saying that.
Thank you.
I mean, you have to agree, I was pretty good.
Absolutely. I loved the stories your listeners sent in, and I really enjoyed your presentation of Jim's story. That was really...
Creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always such a pleasure to hear a great story told with good delivery by somebody with a wonderful, magnificent voice, and that's you. You fit the bill, man.
Well, thank you so much. Sylvia, if people want to follow up on all these books you told us about and all your stories, where do they do that? And you have a blog.
I do. They can find all sorts of information about me at www.sylviashults.wordpress.com, and that is SHULTS. You can find information on the books there, on upcoming projects, and you can follow the Lights Out podcast. I just recently posted episode 60, which is Spooks of Sin City. I went on a ghost tour of Las Vegas, and people get to come on the tour with me.
Oh, and I gotta say, those are worth listening to. I'm a big fan of the podcast, never miss it. And I had the pleasure of being a guest on your podcast at one point. So
that was so much fun.
So I gotta say, if you want to add a spooky podcast to your list, Sylvia is a good choice. Very good choice. In the show notes, I'll have all of those links so that people that didn't get them will be able to click on them.
Fantastic. And I am planning an extra special spooky Halloween edition of Lights Out that'll come out sometime at the end of October. I had a ghost hunter tell me some really great stories, so be on the lookout for James's stories. It'll be great, worth listening to.
All right. Well, Sylvia, I'm going to say it again. You're welcome to come back for year 6. Shall I pencil you in?
Excellent. Absolutely. Pencil me in using a Sharpie.
Well, thank you, Sylvia, and have a wonderful evening or day or wherever it is where you are. Let me say that again. Well, thank you, Sylvia, for your... No, that's no good either. Why am I having trouble with this? Thank you, Sylvia. It has been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure on this end, too, Ron. Thank you so much for having me on the show again.
Well, that's it for this podcast. I want to thank Maurice, Stella, Tom, and my brother Jim for all your stories. A huge hug and thank you to Sylvia for joining us today to swap some truly epic ghost stories. We'll be back next week with more scary stuff. We'll be joined by Schuler Johnson and Jordan Childs from the Paranormal Investigation and Observation Team. You won't want to miss this. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you'll find all the links you'll need. And if you don't mind, please leave reviews or feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.